What I did, I applied Einstein's field equation to the quantum level, described the atom as a mini black hole.
Intelligence is an ongoing process
where the government has literally taken over all aspects of the economy.
And choosing what you want to have in your life, it is absolutely critical, one, to bring yourself to a homeostasis, peaceful place.
The creator of the universe is the master geometer.
The process of spiritual life has to take us beyond the mind.
Through raw foods, I was able to kind of purify myself to a point where I became more conscious of the plant world and began to look at herbs not only as food, but also as medicine, and then beyond that as spiritual helpers in our world.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Miho Ledwith, all the way from Yelm, Washington, one of my close friends that has also looked after me several times now on my travels through the United States. Miho, please tell us your few words of wisdom that you've prepared for us.
Well, thank you for assessing it as wisdom in advance, Michael. But we are all very envious of you here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States tonight. It's 11:35 at night, and I know in Johannesburg it's 25 minutes to 10 in the morning. And we've had several days of gales and wind here, but fortunately all our power and communications are still intact. But nevertheless, we are enormously envious of you all gathered there in Johannesburg today. Now, my dear friends who are in the audience and my colleagues, speakers, I had greatly looked forward to being at this conference physically with the rest of you, but circumstances unfortunately turned out that I wasn't able to make the trip and had to address you in this way through this marvel of technology. Michael Tellinger is a man whom I greatly admire. Among the vast number of people who study the myths and the shadows that surround the circumstances of human origins, he is a rare example of someone who's a worker and a doer, as well as a very profound theoretician and calculator of the abstract. So I was deeply honored when Michael invited me to speak at this conference. It's a unique occasion. I don't think we have ever had before a conference of this stature addressing these specific issues about human origins. But back 47 years ago, when I first addressed these texts from the tablets discovered in Mesopotamia from 1849 onwards, I was struck by a number of things. We studied these enormously interesting texts in James Pritchard's book, Ancient Near Eastern Texts. We were studying at the same time and with the same professor, by coincidence, the Hebrew text of the book of Genesis. I noticed a number of peculiar things. I noticed, first of all, that while we were told it was conventional at that time to begin any work about fundamental matters like the origins of the human race, such as Genesis was dealing with, it was customary to begin with the first letter of the alphabet, which is in Hebrew, Aleph. Now, of course, Genesis does not begin with Aleph. It begins with the second letter, Bet. So I decided one day to put the first letter onto the text of Genesis in Hebrew, and instead of the familiar translation, which we all know, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, those 27 characters of the opening verse of Genesis, when I added one letter to the beginning of that sentence, it changed the translation entirely. Because now how it read was no longer in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It now read, Abba Rashid, bara Elohim et ha-shamayim va'et ha'aretz. In other words, the Father of the beginnings created the Elohim, the heavens and the earth. Now the word Elohim, who are these Elohim? It always puzzled me. It was supposed to be the name for God in the Hebrew Bible. And of any religion, surely the Jews were most insistent that there was only one God. It struck me as odd that the name for God that they used was a plural. Now I know scholars produce all sorts of gymnastics to get around that, but the stark fact remained. And even as a young student, having discovered that there were people like the Nephilim and the Elohim that we had no information on, apart from very rudimentary references, there were other things that struck me in the book of Genesis. For example, even as a young student, I saw that there were about 20 direct parallels between the book of Genesis in the Hebrew version and the Babylonian Mesopotamian book, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In other words, it was patently clear to me that this inspired written word of God was actually based on a much more earlier source, and that the authors of Genesis, because Genesis apparently, to the best consensus of scholars today, was written when the Hebrews were in exile in Babylon in the 6th century BC. It was obvious to me that the authors of Genesis knew those Mesopotamian and Babylonian texts and had used them extensively in writing their own work. So that was quite an eye-opener. It was just opening Pandora's box, really, for me, because obviously there were so many other questions that now came to the fore. And therefore, it was with great delight many years later that Zachariah Sitchin, and had the privilege of meeting him and getting to know him and communicating with him. And he, of course, put an entirely new interpretation on those ancient texts, which, of course, is the interpretation that's the inspiration of today's conference in Johannesburg. We've advanced a great deal since the days of Galileo Galilei, when it said most people in Europe believed the earth was the center of everything, even though, of course, the Greeks, people like Eratosthenes, knew that for 2,200 years ago. But we have advanced a great deal from the days of Galileo, and conceding that the earth revolved around the sun, because now, with the help of the Hubble telescope and other instruments of this kind, we now see, in fact, that we don't have a very good address anywhere, not alone in the solar system, that we actually live in a very rural galaxy called the Milky Way. We live on the fringes of that galaxy, and that galaxy is only one humble member of billions and billions of much greater heavenly organizations than ever was. But despite the fact that we realize we don't have a very good address in the physical creation, we've still held on to the belief that somehow, despite that, we are still at the center of God's design. We were still created as God's only race to rule this world and subdue it and fill the earth, etc., etc. Now, with the Babylonian documents and Mesopotamian documents from Sumer, we have a very different perspective. And even though these documents have been well known for well nigh on 150 years by now, they still have not made their impact. Certain gifted researchers like Michael Tellinger and his colleagues have drawn the conclusions of these documents. And furthermore, in their heroic work of the investigation and preservation of the immense Anunnaki remains all over South Africa, have rendered an inestimable service to the whole of mankind that's trying to discover its history. We have an immense debt that we owe to them. So even though we have advanced a great deal from the time of Galileo about how central we are or are not in the physical universe, there are other areas where we haven't advanced at all. You might say that before Galileo, we were still living in the Dark Ages, but there are some areas where we still haven't even got as far as the Dark Ages. And that is, how did we come into existence as a species at all? That is a big, big question. And we cannot, of course, do anything about understanding where we came from and what we should be doing here until we understand the circumstances in which we came to exist. You might say, does this matter? Does it matter how we came into existence? I mean, we've so many problems here today. We've so much understanding of this and that and the other. Does it really matter to get the facts straight about how we came into existence? Oh, it does matter. It matters enormously. I mean, if we take seriously the insights of quantum physics, now well over a century old, and if we realize how little impact such a well-established theory has had, then if we take quantum physics and quantum mechanics seriously, we know that our attitude towards things is going to create the way that we perceive them. The observer within us is going to change how we experience reality. And this has been going on since we first came into existence as a species. But there's something even more powerful that's being exposed here. If the researchers of people like Michael Tellinger and the others going back to 1849 have anything to tell us about human origins, then we realize that the circumstances the first human beings experienced with their creators, the creators of their physical bodies, right down through the very unhappy experiences they had with them until those beings withdrew from this earth about 4,000 years ago. Then all of those experiences, if quantum physics is correct, have percolated down into our DNA. In 2011, are still carrying the emotions, the attitudes, the reactions that go right back 250,000 years to our origins with the Anunnaki. So does it matter that we know about our origins? Oh yes, it does. Because if anything else quantum physics has to tell us, it's this, that unless we know how the attitudes we have came into existence and how, we will never be able to satisfactorily unravel them. We will never be able to go through the very profound process of reprogramming, which has to lie at the heart of every attempt to regain an expansion of human consciousness and to regain the empowerment which Jesus Christ told us all was our birthright. We will never do any of that until we begin to understand the circumstances of our origin. How we address that and what the implications of it are going to be will be the theme of my own main address on Sunday with you all. But Michael Tellinger, obviously understanding the enormous range of questions that these ruins here in South Africa and in Mesopotamia pose, was perspicacious enough to see what needed to be done. First of all, to preserve these ruins that have suffered so much in the past here in the south of Africa. Even today, for instance, one of the main sources of the ancient texts in Mesopotamia was in the great city of Nineveh, just across the river from modern-day Mosul in northern Iraq. And terrific damage has been done to those sites and to priceless remains there because of the unsettled state of the country. The same could easily be true in South Africa. And Michael and his colleagues' role in preserving that, as I said earlier, has really caused us all to owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. But looking at all of the range of topics that these very ancient ruins pose, Michael has assembled literally a galaxy of talent, 14 speakers who are here with you today. David Hudson, whom we all know, of course, because of his work with monoatomic gold. Kerry Cassidy of the Project Camelot. William Brown, who's done so much work on DNA, its origins and its manipulations. Laura Eisenhower, a descendant of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and what she has to tell us about the secret projects that are in many ways beyond our imagination to grasp. My old friend Alfred Weber, Lloyd Pye, whom I've been in contact with, especially about the Star Child skull. Jennifer Welch from South Africa, Wayne Herschel from South Africa, and Claire Janisch from South Africa, and Louise Claessel from South Africa. All these experts here in these fields have been assembled today to speak to you and to illuminate all these topics. And Willem de Smet and James Gilliland from ECETI here in the state of Washington. So I want to warmly congratulate Michael and his colleagues for their bravery. I don't think that's too exaggerated a term to use, for their bravery and for their integrity and their perseverance and commitment, which led to putting on such a conference as this. In my humble opinion, it's the most significant such conference on this topic that has ever taken place. And how appropriate that such a conference should take place at Michael's alma mater. Thank you, and I look forward to being with you again on Sunday.
I normally speak on biomimicry as a topic which is of great interest to scientists and engineers and architects and designers of today. But what I want to talk about today in this audience is the unlimited future of biomimicry, if we could extrapolate it into all potentials. We are here, this beautiful spaceship Earth, sustaining life while traveling through space. What is it about this Earth that we don't even yet know about? How is it managing to travel through space as many spaceships might, and manage to sustain all of our life on this planet continuously? If history is any guide, much of what we take for granted about the world today simply isn't true. That the world is flat, that the world is round. Most of us are unaware of the hidden assumptions we have in the reasons for thinking the way we do about ourselves, our Earth, and our planet, and our science. Much of our science and our understanding of the world today is based on mechanistic reductionist science. And this mechanistic reductionist science has led to many of the problems we see in the world today. Then should we still be basing our understanding of the world on the same basis? Surely we should be expanding into new understandings of science and new understandings of the world. What absolutely surprised me about our Earth is that when we look to all the creatures on Earth, and there's something between 30 to 100 million different species, all of the species on this planet have figured out how to meet their needs while still continuing to create conditions conducive to life, continually enhancing the place in which they live. Take ants, for example. Ants have been incredibly industrious for millions of years, yet everything that they do nourishes the Earth. We've been industrious for little more than a few centuries, and we have brought about a decline in almost every ecosystem on the planet. The question I have is what does nature have within its ingenious basis that we have yet to discover that might actually give us clues for how we ourselves can live on the spaceship and maintain it in a way that continues to create conditions conducive to life. But as we dig deeper, what else can nature reveal to us about our real understanding of the planet? So biomimicry comes from the words bios, meaning life, and mimicry, meaning to imitate. Practice of learning from and then emulating nature's genius to solve human challenges. In the definition we have for biomimicry is the conscious emulation of nature's genius. Not just emulating these so-called technological miracles, but the same genius that allows all these creatures to continue to enhance the place in which they live. The genius of nature is that every one of these creatures seems to achieve some technological miracles and reveals to us that we know very little. We think we are the greatest achievement, one of the greatest species on this planet, and know so much, yet all of these creatures seem to reveal how little we actually do know. So my favorite inspiration, the hummingbird, manages to travel across the Gulf of Mexico, which is 1,000 kilometers long, 60 kilometers an hour without stopping. And before it does so, it stops to fill up with 2.1 grams of fuel. Now that fuel is not jet fuel. That fuel is nectar from a plant. And as it fills up with the fuel, it's ensuring that that plant will continue. It is pollinating that plant, ensuring that there will be more plants for the next season and then for its own offspring. What's extraordinary for me to consider in this example is how, as that bird is meeting its energy needs, it is continuing life, it is enhancing life. Imagine we could find energy sources and ways of tapping energy that continue to enhance life. So biomimicry offers us the opportunity to look to copying nature at many different levels. One could be level form, where we just mimic shapes that we find in nature. One of the very first examples of biomimicry in the more recent history is of the invention of Velcro, which found the way that birds attached to animal fur is actually little hooks and barbules. And if we copied that, which is what George de Mestral managed to do, we can create the equivalent of Velcro, being able to attach and detach continuously. But that's just mimicking form. When nature makes that berm, nature makes it using divine chemistry that actually continues to be benign, and all of the materials that nature uses continue to cycle into the earth and regenerate it. So that next level of biomimicry is the level of process, mimicking the way nature makes materials, mimicking the way nature makes things. Okay, the final part is being able to mimic at a systems level. As we mimic at a systems level, we can mimic the whole way that every part is interconnected, and altogether every part meets its own needs while enhancing the whole. So the best way to understand biomimicry is through examples. Our creation of airplanes and our ability to fly was inspired by birds. But as we've got more and more specific in the needs for flight, we've actually started to look to more specific mechanisms within nature. The Airbus A380 needed to have a wingspan that would be wide enough to lift that huge plane, but within the 80-meter requirement of being able to turn within airports. The only way that the engineers could solve this was by looking at large birds like eagles, which have wingtips that are able to move in both directions. This enables large birds to be able to catch thermals, but not have such a wide wingspan. So they mimic this exact principle in the Airbus A380 wings, and you'll see at the end, the Airbus A380 wings actually look very similar to that. And this enabled the Airbus wingspan to be within 2 centimeters of that 80-meter limit. We've also looked to birds specifically for making hollow structures to fly, and more recently looking at the hollow structures for the entire membrane of the airplane. This is an image of the future of Airbus. What would it look like in 2050? Obviously, their perspective as engineers today, but looking more and more and more like biological creatures and mimicking more and more of natural systems, having membranes that are tuned to the environment and able to shift according to light levels, having each seat within the plane actually tapping the energy of the occupants and using that energy to fire up the holograms that they use to watch their video screens. And it's not only airplanes that become more and more like living things. Our buildings are starting to look more and more like living things as we use biomimicry to inspire us on how to regulate temperature and to allow our buildings actually to capture and use water and to clean water and to have skins that function like, membranes so that the walls of the building become alive, that they can change according to rainfall patterns, according to humidity and carbon dioxide levels, that you can actually go into the building, and as you touch the walls, they respond to touch and allow different amounts of light in. And even creating smart materials that as they get activated by different levels of humidity or carbon dioxide or sunlight, they will change their material functionality. So either like Polaroid getting darker or opening up tiny pores that let oxygen in and let carbon dioxide out, or manage humidity. So our buildings also are starting to mimic more and more living beings as we start to realize that nature's figured out how to solve many of our challenges already and do it in very effective, attuned and responsive ways. It's when we take biomimicry into the world of robotics that it gets very interesting. We're starting to see robotics by Festo, which are very, very lifelike, being able to take that very pulsive movement of the jellyfish and the rays and even the flight mechanisms of the seagull and mimicking them exactly to create robotics that are very, very lifelike. Even penguins that look like they are penguins as they swim underwater, totally robotic, and fish too that have the same swimming mechanisms as real life fish. When we take it into the world of fluid dynamics and start to actually understand how energy and fluids move in nature and how we have actually missed this in many of our engineering and scientific applications. One of my favorite ones to explore is the movement of water and similarly the movement of air. Whenever you look at water moving down a river, it always moves in this beautiful meandering pattern and then creating these vortex flow forms that you find evident as you allow the water to move down your plug hole. You see that spiraling flow form pattern. This spiraling flow form pattern actually has a logarithmic growth to it, and in many cases it is in the golden ratio. This ratio that we find in nature, as it grows with a very specific numeric sequence. You can see it in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions in this image. There's a company called PAX that actually has started to look at if this is the natural fluid flow form of fluids in nature, then maybe we should be mimicking that flow form when we try to move fluids to create propellers and rotors and motors and fans. And they've actually started to have the ability to mimic those specific flow, specific geometries to create these fans and rotors. And they get anything between 10 to 80% improvement in energy efficiency. And these fans and rotors achieve a 75% reduction in noise. My favorite example from them is this Pax Lily. It is a water impeller, not a propeller. And it is in the golden ratio in the one dimension across the top and in the other dimension downwards. And as they set this lily up to spin within water, it starts to suck the water into a tornado-like flow form. If you put it into a water tank of this size, it starts to spin the water in this very specific flow form that looks like a donut. It creates the tornado in the center that feeds upon itself. You can put one in a tank this size. There's a human being standing next to the example of the Pax Lily, and the equivalent competitor has a equivalent mixer of this size. The Pax Lily only uses the electricity of 2 light bulbs, yet as it starts to spin, it generates such a powerful flow form that it actually feeds upon itself and can mix this entire tank. So there's obviously something within this vortex flow form that's very intriguing. And another person who tapped who had a lot of interest in this flow form was Victor Schoberger. And he was fascinated how trout and salmon were able to swim upstream and able to maintain a stillness within fast-moving water. And recent research into this has revealed that trout have a very specific shape, that if they swim into a vortex flow form within a river that's set up behind a stone, like an eddy, they actually have the ability to use that vortex flow form to move along the edge of their scales. And it's rather like squeezing a wet bar of soap up water, upstream. These trout have actually evolved over time to tap the ability to tap the energy in these vortices and use that as an extra thrust to jump them upstream. Victor Schroberger did a lot of research into this vortex flow form and eventually started inventing extraordinary machines that started to spin fluids, air and liquids, into very specific flow forms. And if you see the images, you'll see they look very much like natural fluid flow forms. His energy repulsion that he invented, as he started to spin it at very high speeds, it actually started to take off and to levitate. And he was very much involved, according to history, he was very much involved with developing flying saucers within the Nazi scientific community. My other inventor that looked into spinning systems is Dr. John Searle. John Searle's energy generator also spins. It actually has a middle part spinning in one direction and an outer part spinning in another direction. And some people looking at it says it's an entity. It's the closest thing to a living thing that man can make, making these spinning, moving parts. And as he started to spin his at higher and higher speeds, created a levitational effect and did a lot of research into levitation and creating these flying saucers that you can read about in some old newspaper clippings and recently made into a film on the John Searle story. There's obviously things in nature that we don't yet understand, because this seems to defy our understanding of our current understanding of gravity. And as we look more and more into nature, we start to find that biology itself needs to be revisioned, not revised. And a recent book with this title talks about how our understanding of biology has been dramatically transformed in the recent scientific discoveries, starting to recognize how things are all interconnected and how quantum effects actually are very much alive and noticeable in biology. As we read about in quantum physics, even our understanding of science is getting turned on its head. And as we realize that physics and chemistry and biology are all interlinked, and we're all connected to this vast field, the quantum field, it's really important for us to actually recognize that as we study nature and we study biological effects with this new understanding of biology and the quantum field, we might start to realize that biomimicry could go in a whole other direction. In fact, as we look at the emergent behavior of self-organizing systems and we combine that with chaos theory, we start to see how these fractal images that look very much like life are based on our understanding of systems being much more open and less closed. We make a lot of assumptions on having closed systems so we can solve for our scientific problems. But as we recognize that open systems are the real state, we start to generate images through things like chaos theory and fractal geometry that look far more like natural organisms. In fact, as we start to reveal, as we look deeper and deeper into our new ways of understanding biology, we realize that because we had this mechanistic reductionist science and broke things into parts, when we start to see things in wholes, we start to realize that these flow forms and this energy movement within nature, within biological organisms, reveals another whole layer to biology, this pulse of life that seems to have been left out of our study. We were studying life, but studying it in parts and forgetting that life itself, this pulse of life, is a very key part of biology, and it needs to be taken into our science. And as an engineer myself, I'm really intrigued to say, can we as engineers bring life back into science and bring life back into our technology? And this has led me on a journey to understand the deep patterns in nature, how they reveal much more about biology and life than we ever thought, and how they actually reveal a lot more about that interface between physics and biology that actually opens up a new understanding of science. So as we've looked at these flow forms in nature, it reveals that patterns in nature are something of a clue for us to explore. So I'm really intrigued in what patterns repeat themselves in nature, what fractal patterns are there specifically in the movement of energy. When we tug at a single thing in nature, we find it's attached to the rest of the world, and every part is connected. When we study different sciences, we look at the very small or the very large. Each of those have a very specific scientific community for them. I'm curious of not what's the difference between subatomic studies of materials, what's the difference between that and biology, geology, and astronomy. I'm curious what's the thing that connects all these together. What is the similarity between all these layers of reality? And what's the similarity between what connects all of these things together? So if we go from the very small and we look for commonalities and patterns and movement and flow, we'll find that electrons, when they're allowed to move freely in bubble chambers, they move in this amazing spiral form, just as our great spiral galaxies move in this amazing spiral form. And everything in between that we see in the world around us. This is an image of a red cabbage cut in half, and you can see the spiral arms of the spiral galaxy within the very center of that. The same flow form in that as in the galaxies. This fractal geometry we'll find reveals that the patterns that we see in the very small repeat in the very large and repeat all the way along, and it's all related to the movement of energy. And we'll find in this image here of a fern that the very small parts of the leaf have a pattern of a center with little parts coming out that then form the bigger leaves, which have a center with parts coming out that then form the even bigger parts. And that same pattern repeating from the very small to the very large. So we should, in many cases, look for patterns that repeat from the very small to the very large. The two that I've just covered, the branching patterns and the spiraling patterns, actually are connected. In fact, the branching pattern very often in nature follows a very specific sequence known as the Fibonacci sequence. It's basically a sequence of numbers where you add two numbers together and you get the next number. So 1 and 2 make 3, 3 and 2 make 5, 5 and 3 make 8, 8 and 5 make 13. And we'll find this pattern in very often in many parts of nature, including, for example, in the growth of rodent populations. As we take this Fibonacci sequence and we put it into 2 dimensions, making different squares of those sizes, we actually have the ability to connect those edges of those squares. We create a spiral, and then that 2 dimensions can be taken into 3 dimensions. And that is the Fibonacci or golden ratio spiral that I referred to before. But it's basically about dividing the sequence of Fibonacci numbers, the one by the other, to get closer and closer to this number, which is 1.618, or known as phi. It turns out that whenever we allow energy to move on its own, it will always move in spirals and into spiraling vortices. And many of these spirals and spiraling vortices, which grow in this very specific logarithmic spiral, are related to this golden ratio, this Fibonacci sequence. The vortex is, in fact, the principal creative movement system in the universe. This was studied by Victor Schoberger, and he actually looked at 2 different ways that this vortex flow can happen. A spiraling vortex of energy or fluid, of air, of water can actually spiral from the center towards the outside or from the outside towards the inside. So centripetal or centrifugal flow forms. And when they flow from the center towards the outside, creates a lot of movement on the edge, generating a lot of friction and needing more energy to be added to keep it going. As it spins from the outside towards the inside, which is the centripetal flow form, which you see your water going down your plug hole, it means that the higher speed or faster moving particles are in the center. There's not as much friction around the outside. It, according to Victor Schoberger, has a cooling effect as opposed to that heat generating effect of the centrifugal spiral. It turns out that these 2 spirals cannot really exist on their own, and it tends to be that the one exists with the other, and the 2 can feed upon each other in this amazing flow form that we saw in that tank where the Pax lily was starting to turn and create that flow form. It looked a lot like a donut. And these interacting spirals actually create one of the most basic flow forms we find in nature. And the torus shape is the basic energy flow design that the pulse of life favors. It's the feeding of the building up and the breaking down, the heating up and the cooling down. And these spirals move together, creating these very stable flow forms. In fact, one of the most stable flow forms we find in fluid dynamics. It's a flow form that we see dolphins like to play with, and they appear to create things within water, but it's actually just air and water being turned into this flow form that creates the illusion of a form within the water. It turns out that when these two flow forms, these two spirals, grow within that golden ratio Fibonacci sequence, as the one spiral feeds upon the other, it has a generative effect where the interference is always constructive. That means that a flow form within the golden ratio will have the ability to hold its form for longer because it doesn't have as much of a destructive interference pattern. And this is what the Pax Lily is able to take advantage of as it starts to spin, generating that constructive interference, generating a very strong whirlpool tornado effect with only a small amount of energy to get it going. So if we took energy or air or water and we turn it in upon itself to create this flow form, it creates the illusion of a new form within the existing form. You can imagine as we take the movement of energy and want to form material reality out of it, all we'd need to do is set up this flow form. As we do that, it has a flow form that generates which has inertia, and it'll have mass because of E equals mc squared. And the only definition of matter is something that has mass and inertia. And this flow form actually reveals that connection between energy and matter, between energy flow and the material reality. That actually it is this movement of energy into this vortex that creates the illusion of material reality. Phi cycle could be the origin of the word physical. And we see this movement of this energy flow form evident in many different examples, as you see in these images. And the flow form of the magnetic field around a magnet, is it the field creating the magnet, or is the magnet creating the field? That picture in the top right there is of a black hole, very similar flow form, and the one just next to that, the picture generated by some scientists at the University of Michigan of what a photon might look like, what a packet of light might look like, because we know that light can be both a wave and a particle. Perhaps the wave turning in upon itself in this flow form creates those packets of light to look just like that. So it's the interaction between energy and matter that's really of interest, and we can find this when we look at how music creates shapes and patterns when we can actually stop the music onto a surface. So just like light coming out of the projector, when it's stopped on the screen, creates the image of the screen. Imagine we had music being played and we could stop that music on a surface and see what shapes and forms that music would be playing. This takes you into the world of cymatics, and these are some images of how sound created different forms, geometric patterns that look a lot like the patterns that we see in nature. Here's some images of a loudspeaker with some salt on it, and you can actually see the different specific geometric patterns being created by different specific sounds. And it turns out there's a very obvious connection between sound and form. And obviously that leads us to question, is there a connection in between sound and things like the geometry we find in nature, like the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence? Well, it's of much interest to many musicians to look at that golden ratio. Stradivarius, in designing his violins, actually deliberately used that ratio to create very specific harmonious sounds. Many musicians look to the golden ratio in creating their music pieces. Much of the musical pieces actually create their climax at the 1.6 rough point and not sort of near the end or at the middle. Stradivarius created his violins with that specific ratio to create very specific harmonic tones. If we take a string, and this is the diatonic scale by Pythagoras, if we take a string and we put our finger on that string at any one point and we strum that string, it turns out the points that sound harmonious on the diatonic scale are the ones where you divide that string at the golden ratio. And there's a very strong relationship between that scale and octaves. You have 7 different notes, and the 8th note is a doubling in frequency of the first note. And as we take these octaves of music further and further up the scale to the 48th and 49th octave, we'll find that we have that same octave and harmonic within the colors of light. So we have the visible light spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. All of these seem to reveal that there's definite harmonious order within the material reality. And the Egyptians used to call matter frozen music. You can see in this image, that amazing image of the flower looking a lot like the projecting part of this gramophone, that it is actually the movement of energy into very specific ordered patterns that generate all the material reality we see around us. And as we look into nature and study these patterns, it reveals to us a lot greater understanding of our energetic world flowing into our material world. And modern science, as we start to look into that for that unified field, are starting to look for that 0-point energy field out of which energy flows to form all of the material particles that we know of. And superstring theory is this theory that all of this energetic field has potential superstrings that start to wiggle. And as they wiggle in different ways, they generate different notes. And all of these different notes are particles. And it's recognition that matter itself is just the progressive densification of vibration. So we've seen this pattern evident in nature around us. It would be interesting if we could see this pattern evident in the very small as much as we see it evident in the large. This as above, so below consideration. Well, Plato said that all of reality is made out of these 5 platonic solids. These 5 shapes and all their combinations create all the possible structures in our 3-dimensional universe. Is he just hypothesizing some sacred geometry, or could he actually be correct? Well, the work of Dan Winter reveals that if you took these, this one donut flow form, or these 2 vortices interacting to be an electron pair, the only way you could possibly stack other electrons to grow more complex form around that is similar to the only way you can stack gyroscopes. If you had one like spinning like this and put another one at that angle, it would be destabilized. But there's very specific geometries that create stable flow forms and create more complex structures. It means that if you put flat ends of the cones on each end, the only way you could stack them was if those flat ends of the cones were against the sides of the platonic solids. Now, we know that there are a certain number of electrons in each of the electron shells of an atom, but we never really knew why that specific number. This is one of the only theories I've found that actually indicates why that specific number of electrons in each shell. Looking at the harmonic progressions, or the different ways of ordering the elements in the periodic table. And it actually turns out that if you ordered these elements in the periodic table in a spiral form, it starts to be a lot more, it starts to reveal a lot more about these elements. And that each of these elements actually just being combined up of frequencies of densified vibration, each element actually has a sound or a vibration to it. If we actually were to put them into a spiral, you could arrange them so that the noble non-reactive gases are down the center of the spiral, just like the calm eye of a tornado, and the more and more reactive ones are further and further along the edge of that spinning tornado. So from the very small to the very large, what actually can we see this same pattern in our universe? Well, we've definitely seen it in that image of the spiraling galaxy. The theory to explain our expanding universe is based on the Big Bang, and the understanding that there was this Big Bang and the universe has been expanding ever since. Well, Nassim Haramein says it's rather like blowing up a balloon. And on the balloon, you can imagine a lot of coins stuck on the balloon. Those are the planets and the galaxies all moving out. His question was, well, who's blowing up that balloon? And it's relating to the fact that as a balloon expands, your lungs have to contract to create the air volume to go into that expansion. And he was interested in the idea that they could be continuously expanding and contracting, and that the universe actually is in a continual cycle of birth and death. If we assume that the universe is indeed in a perpetual cycle of birth and death, then the donut torus shape can perfectly explain and model this behavior. This is a statement from Professor Joseph Silk from the Department of Physics at Oxford University. And you'll see in this image pictures from a book I have on the universe that actually shows the growth of a galaxy. And you can see the very active galaxy. You can almost see the 2 active arms of the vortices there as well. And Walter Russell, who studied the deep connection between everything and everything else, his quote, "All of existence is formed from interrelated spirals or vortices that radiate out or explode and draw and implode simultaneously and infinitely. In fact, that very original consideration of the pulsing rivers and that pulse of life that we start to see evident as we allow ourselves to notice the connections between the parts in the whole is actually a real clue to understanding not only our universe, but the energy flow within it. So if we see it from the very small to the very large, as above, so below, can we see it within ourselves, as within, so without? Now, every single atom is going to be generating spin, because every single atom is, in fact, a particle of motion, not a particle in motion. So if every atom is generating spin, then every atom is generating torsion. So you can imagine that a magnet has a magnetic field, a tornado will have a torsion field. Therefore, every atom is a torsion field generator. And the work of the Russians, especially the Akimov group, in studying torsion fields is really intriguing. Turns out that torsion waves have very interesting effects on matter. You can imagine if all matter is just spinning energy into form, that if you apply an external spin or an external torsion field, you can affect material reality. And there's a hypothesis, therefore, that someone like Uri Geller, who can actually bend a spoon with his thoughts, with his focused laser-like thoughts, has the ability to actually focus his energy of his mind to bend and affect material reality, similar to the way that torsion fields can affect reality. So in a way, it creates this hypothesis that are our thoughts, in fact, torsion fields. And as we learn to focus them and concentrate them, we can have impact on our material reality, which leads us to have a better understanding of how some great masters are able to achieve this. In fact, when we look at the brain, the spiral convolutions of the brain and the spiral fibers of the nerves indicate to us that our very thought process is a rhythmical electrical wave formation and is in fact vortex regulated. You can see from these images that our heart and our lungs also tend to have this flow form related to the spiral. These images of the heart muscles, you can actually see the two muscles forming around each other. And it turns out in some research done on chicken embryos that the blood starts to move in these two vortex flow forms first, and after that the heart starts to form around the moving blood flow. And it's almost like the heart starts to form a resonant cavity that allows that blood flow to continue. But it was the movement of the flow first before the heart. And in fact, there's a lot of research going into the recognition that the heart is not a pump. It is not physically able to pump that amount of fluid across the entire body through tiny little veins and arteries. And the research into the heart not being a pump, but actually this vortex flow form, is actually what allows this to be possible. And the interesting thing is that some researchers looking at our emotions and understanding our heartbeat and our heart rate during different emotions, especially the work of those in the Heart Math Institute, our heart has a big beat and a little beat and a big beat and a little beat. And when we're in a state of peace or relaxation or a state of bliss or love, there's the measurement of the big beat to the little beat is very, very close to that golden ratio. And it's indication that that flow form of the heart, when it actually moves in a very specific pulse of that golden ratio, you can imagine that generative feeling that we feel when we are in love or in peace is the same sort of generative flow form that we see in that Pax lily moving in that tank, generating a far bigger effect from a tiny little spinning Pax lily impeller. Essentially, we can see that that very same flow form in our heart is the same flow form that created the universe, the same flow form in all the atoms, and the same flow form in all of nature. In that pine cone in our heart have that very same flow form. Essentially, the human body is in resonance with the living mathematics in nature. And as we play with this flow form and we start to understand it, we realize that there's this pulse of life within it, and there's this deep connection between energy and matter within this very specific flow form. In fact, the life force energy that we see in these Caduceus pictures is very similar to that same pattern flow form that we see of the representation of torsion fields. So if this very powerful flow form is evident within us, then we have obviously a connection to a lot of power. And the Egyptians have a statement that's also in the Hindu Bija mantra. Everything in the universe, having been created by a certain vibratory pattern or combination of patterns, could also be mastered or influenced by the utterance of its corresponding sound pattern. And this image here of the voice box, actually, it's in a very specific shape that as you speak, every word you say comes out with a spin, with a vortex to it, and that actually that power of the torsion field is in every word that you speak. Not surprising then, the works of the likes of Masaru Emoto, looking at the influence of words, of music, of sound, and of thoughts on water and the different frozen flow forms and the shapes that are generated as we focus our minds. And the works of those looking at the secret life of plants, the effects of music and sound and words and on plants and their growth. You can see here the effect on water of certain words versus certain other words as well. And different music, music like heavy metal music, generated to break down systems, generated for the energy of not liking the current system, versus the music of Mozart, generating extraordinary order out of disorder. I think that word, that the consideration that music creates order out of noise is very evident when you see how sound creates order in the water. So the individual power is evident in these experiments, and the work of Lynn McTaggart, looking at the intention experiment and recording all the different experiments done when groups come together to affect reality, and the work of the transcendental meditators affecting the level of violence or crime within a city through the focusing of their deep intentions. So it seems that mastering the power of our ability to focus our mind, the ability to focus our thoughts, and the ability to set our heart into that deep loving vibration is actually really, really something worth investigating and worth considering. There's a lot of research into those who actually have had the influence on reality. The books on China's super psychics, the PK Man, and then the great work of the life and teachings of the masters of the Far East suddenly become not so out there, but maybe potentials that we could actually look at in more detail. My favorite, most recent research done into the effect of focused minds in groups upon reality is the work of William Tiller, PhD, who's the Professor Emeritus at Stanford University in the Department of Material Science and Engineering. He was fascinated by the power of thought to affect physical material reality and set up very specific experiments to measure this. He took a group of people able to be very focused in their meditation and got them to focus on a black box where they would put their energy of the intention to raise the pH of water by 1. They would then take that black box and put it into a Faraday cage where they'd put the glass of water, and they would then watch and measure the pH of that water, and it would actually change, you can see in the image, by a very significant degree. What was even more interesting is they actually had to repeat this experiment over and over again in different parts of the world and in different parts of the States, and they actually realized that as they repeated the experiment over and over again in this specific space, after a while they could just put a glass of water in that Faraday cage and it would raise its pH by 1. And what William Tiller said, it's the collective results for these target experiments showed unequivocally that the unstated assumption of establishment science is very, very wrong, and it's time for us to take a major change in our worldview of nature. He actually proposed this hypothesis that the thoughts of these focused minds actually conditioned the space of that reality to change the pH by 1. And he proposed another thought experiment. Imagine a person working on a free energy machine, an idea for a perpetual motion machine, over and over again within their laboratory for over 20 years, studying and searching and starting to find evidence that it must be possible and starting to test it and prove it, till it got to a point where it actually worked. And an outsider comes and observes it in the laboratory, sees that it's working and gets really excited. However, when that machine was removed from that laboratory to outside, where the social consciousness and the general awareness is conditioned the space to say that this is not feasible, not possible, means that machine would not work in the external reality. And this idea of conditioning the space is actually really, really worth contemplating and thinking about what impact, if all of energy turns into matter and all of energy is influenced by thought, and if all of energy, in fact, as we get deeper into it, could actually be based from consciousness and from thought, then all of the technology that we work with is going to be so obviously influenced by our thoughts and our conscious beliefs. So obviously this starts to make us wonder about the applications for this new understanding. There's some well-known ones where we look at water treatment, and obviously the movement of water in very specific flow forms has the ability to energize that water, add oxygen, and actually treat that water. What many people think about is the bringing back that sort of life force energy within the water. It's used in biodynamic farming, and you can see some more recent applications where we take the very specific frequencies of healthy water, put them into something that holds the memory like metal, and put that next to the water. Has that vibrationary frequency that affects obviously everything, but particularly the water, because all of matter is just intensified vibrations or densified vibrations. Then you can affect reality with different vibrations, and water obviously a focus of many. What I'm very interested in is where we take the recognition that if every element has a very specific frequency or vibration to it, then we could affect those elements by playing different frequencies or vibrations to them. For purely hypothetical reasons, imagine you had a pollutant within a water place, and you could play a frequency that would have a destructive interference onto that element. You could actually eliminate that pollutant within an area. In fact, harmony makes small things grow, and lack of it makes great things decay. You can imagine how using different frequencies could affect reality in different ways, and could affect material in very different ways. And the idea that we could actually start to use frequencies to have a positive influence on life instead of a negative vibration with negative effect on life. Understanding of vibration for healing has been definitely applied and used in many different ways, from the vibrations from people's hands and the vibration of prayer to these new technologies that we use, things like the SCIO, that actually use vibration and frequency to both diagnose and to treat in different ways. The very influence of shape affecting a space and very specific geometries affecting a space has been applied in sacred geometric architecture for centuries. You can even see the image there of the labyrinth on the Church Cathedral floor is a two-dimensional depiction of that donut torus flow form. And all of the different cathedrals and things like the Gut Arnhem very specifically designed with a shape to influence the space and to have an effect on our consciousness and maybe even on our heart, to bring us into that space of resonance with that calm, loving, blissful energy. And obviously the power of shape in general is fascinating, and specifically in pyramids. It's a lot of evidence to show that pyramids have an influence on the space around them. There's a picture there of a pyramid in Russia that was built and tested by scientists. I actually went to visit that one in Moscow, and the research indicates that it had an influence on the seismic activity around the pyramid, actually reducing the amount of seismic activity in the area. And they did some tests where they put salt and pepper in the pyramid and then fed it to prisoners in a prison, and apparently it had an effect on them psychologically in a way that was actually quite calming. It is very interesting research and worth considering. Then more recently, there was some energy generation information in Popular Science magazine about a Frenchman called Louis Michaud, who's looking at generating energy by mimicking a tornado shape and actually spinning energy into that tornado form and using that to as a source of energy. And then Marco Rodin winding a coil with the wires in that very specific flow form that you can see looks just like the golden ratio, or the image that you might see of a sunflower head. That allowing the electrons to move in their natural flow form, determined to have a 62.5% greater magnetic output than the present-day standard wound electrical coils in tests. So if we're actually looking at all the research and all the work done by so many in the realm of so-called free energy, it's not so much about free energy, it's about recognizing that all of matter is actually coming from energy, and the ability to use flow forms to tap energy and to influence material reality. Perpetual motion is not in question, rather there's some unknown form of energy which is transformed into electrical energy. And it's not surprising, therefore, that people like Victor Schoberger, who were looking to spin water and air and creating these flow forms, actually had the ability to tap energy. And then that link between that energy and the levitational effects, that as you started to spin them faster and faster, actually started to influence the gravitational effects and start to create flying saucers. It's really intriguing as you look into the Searle effect, when he says, in the laws of nature there is nothing impossible except that the state of your mind makes it so. When we just realize the ability to condition the space with our thoughts, and the ability of our thoughts also to be in that torsion field, that when people looking at his Searle effect generator thinking it's very much like a living entity. And it's also its interaction between gravity and that spin is evident there as well. Okay, this is where it gets even more interesting, actually, and when I started to really make this connection between all of this and UFOs, even go even deeper. This book, Ether Technology, A Rational Approach to Gravity Control by Rose Sigma, you can see right on the cover that flow form indicated there as the UFO is in motion. He did a lot of research and showed how electricity, magnetism, and gravitation are actually all part of a triad and all very significantly interconnected. And then the recognition that our understanding of gravity is obviously needing a whole rethink is evident in the fact that all of this new understanding of science and all of these deep patterns in nature reveal that there's something more to even gravity. So then maybe our understanding of physics needs to be rethought, and maybe then our assumptions that certain UFO craft are not actually feasible and their way that they fly are not feasible are based on the fact that our understanding of physics is actually very limited. Here's a quote from the Exempt from Disclosure by Robert Collins. "You're assuming that ET crafts are made with our technology. Many years ago we made that same mistake, and it took us several years to correct the mistake and start fresh from the drawing board. Their technology is nothing similar to ours. They used a different physics principle that we still don't fully understand. I've worked on this project for 12 years, and I sometimes call myself dumb because I try to compare the craft with our technology." It's interesting to see that a lot of the new research into time travel and the ability to actually jump space-time has got a lot of connection to spinning and spiraling and circulating light beams and quantum tunneling. The spinning vortices, you can imagine just the idea of a wormhole having this vortex or spiraling flow form to it. That these crafts and all these different witnessed evidences of how crafts actually move, how they move through space and time, how they jump through space and time. There's a lot of it to indicate that time and space, understanding of gravity, energy, electricity, and magnetism all have to be reconsidered as we look at science in this way. It was this book, The Cosmic Pulse of Life, the revolutionary biological power behind UFOs, that made me think again as well. If you imagine that flow form that we saw in the Ether Technology book, and then here's this book talking about the revolutionary biological power behind UFOs. It's that same flow form that we see in our heart, that pulse of life that we see in that UFO technology. And it's now not surprising, therefore, that there could be a consideration that this power behind the UFOs is perhaps actually biological. The indications of invisibility, being able to change frequency to not be able to be in the visible light spectrum, anti-gravity effects, being able to go faster even than the speed of light, all of these become feasible and considerable as we look into this new understanding of energy and flow forms. In fact, when we look at our actual physical senses, they're in a very, very narrow band. What we see and what we hear are a very small filtered amount of the frequency that's all around us. And as we expand our sensors, things through radar we can actually see things that we were unable to see with our eyes or with our existing senses. We start to have evidence of things that appear to be there in the radar, even though we can't see them physically. And that's very much indication of that frequency effect. The visible light spectrum is a very narrow band within the entire frequency spectrum, and it's very likely that these craft that we see and don't see are able to tap all the layers of those different wavelengths or different frequencies. What's interesting for me to consider is the fact that every frequency has got a very specific connection to consciousness as well. As you can see, different parts of the brain in a state of beta or alpha or theta have different levels of consciousness associated with them. So you can imagine as these craft are able to tap different levels of frequency and you can actually see them or not see them, similarly they must be able to be interacted with different levels of consciousness. And this brings me back to tying everything together. When we remember that the torsion fields have an impact on reality, when we remember that our thoughts ourselves our own thoughts can have impact on material reality as torsion fields, and when we realize that consciousness and energy, those different layers of frequency, have a vast spectrum to them, it becomes interesting for us to look at the evidence from the UFO community. From Colonel Phillips J. Corso in the day after Roswell, the vehicle was simply an extension of their own bodies because it was tied into their neurological systems. You can see how the physics was not at all the same physics that we are using for our technology. Here's a picture of the Utron, where Ralph Ring has recently been talking about it. The Utron was the key to it all. Carr said it accumulated energy because of its shape, and it focused it, and it also responded to our conscious intentions. When we operated the machine, we didn't work any controls. We went into a kind of meditative state, and all three of us focused our intentions on the effect we wanted to achieve. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's what we did, and that's what worked. Carr had tapped into some principle which is not understood, in which consciousness melds with engineering to create an effect. You can't write that into equations. I have no idea how he knew it would work, but it did. Going deeper, I've heard that the aliens used the same principle to operate their craft. Their physics seems to work in harness with their consciousness. The craft amplifies the power of their minds. The craft won't operate without the pilots. So one part is the advanced engineering, and the other is the mental and spiritual ability. We may have duplicated some of the first, but we may be a long way from the second yet. So ultimately, what this presentation is looking to do is to combine all of these layers and layers of evidence to show that, to me, this interaction between UFOs, between our new understanding of science and between consciousness is very, very much worth investigating. In fact, what I like to think of is that my body itself is one of the most extraordinary UFOs. It has the ability to generate torsion fields, have that pulse of life, that vortex flow form within my heart, and the two combined actually have the power to influence material reality and may even have the ability to influence space-time. And that the very thoughts that I think condition the space for how I experience my reality, and the very way I think might actually influence the way of whether I actually will have any experience in my physical reality of other dimensions. And when we talk about the ability of certain masters to actually be able to levitate through focusing their mind and focusing their thoughts, and we recognize that our own planet, our own Earth, this beautiful spaceship that we are traveling in, has that same flow form around it generating itself. It is not at all absurd to think that UFOs are possible when we see that this flow form is actually what makes our own spaceship be able to maintain life as it moves through space. And when we talk about extraterrestrial, perhaps we're talking about things that come from beyond material reality, and that becomes an interesting perspective. Everything that comes from the zero-point energy field of all matter that comes from it actually is extraterrestrial, outside of matter. And it's not surprising that extraterrestrial craft will also be operating on principles that are beyond the understanding of our physical material reality. And this quote here from Elizabeth Clara, a South African woman who lived in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands and had interactions with alien and other beings. She wrote that the spaceship is created from pure energy into a physical substance, generating light from the cosmic plasma of eternity, never faltering, always alive and pulsating, shaped like a galaxy. Perhaps it is not at all something we should ignore when we actually see that what she's referring to there makes perfect sense in the new understanding of science.
Aloha in Hawaii means that the aloha spirit that is within you is the spirit of aloha that is within me, and we are one. Now, the topic of my presentation, one of the primary focuses, is the light-encoded DNA filament and biomolecular quantum communication. And what that means is it is a synthesis and an integration of two theories within the biological sciences that I've done through extensive research. The theory of quantum mechanics and the theory of morphic resonance. When these two are brought together into a biological perspective, many of the phenomenology that has been evasive, been unable to be explained by mainstream science, are explained very elegantly, I think. So, a little bit on my background. It's very academic. I have a Bachelor of Science in Cellular and Molecular Biology. I worked at a microbial genetics and genomics lab called MGEM. And this is actually kind of interesting because the principal investigator of that lab is actually very famous within the scientific community. When the anthrax attacks occurred on the U.S. Senate, he was one of the few specialists in the country that was capable of analyzing the anthrax spores. So the FBI rushed the anthrax spores to his lab, and using the techniques that they developed, he was able to precisely identify the exact location from which those spores originated. And it was a U.S. government military government facility in the Midwest. After the success that his lab had with that rapid and extremely accurate identification, the U.S. Senate and U.S. Congress were more than happy to send him all the funding that they needed. And he turned out to be one of the most highly paid individuals in the entire university. I actually worked at one of the most advanced biological laboratories in the country. We'd routinely run $1,000 experiments on multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. But true to the full archetype, I left that and I went to New York City and I got a master's in applied recombinant DNA technology because I saw that as a way to really work at a molecular level with DNA. And what I've found, though, is that this physical means of splicing and rearranging DNA is unnecessary. And I'll be showing that with the electromagnetic and electronic properties of DNA. Right now, I'm pursuing a PhD in cellular and molecular biology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I work at the Institute for Biogenesis Research, where we do stem cell-based regenerative therapy. And there's a lot that I could say about stem cell technology, and I'd be happy to. It won't be so much in this, because that's kind of off topic. I also teach a genetics lab, and I can't say how amazing it's been to be of service in that capacity, teaching. It's really been a very rewarding experience. But on to the topic at hand. I'd like to start off by clearing up a large, common misconception the DNA is not a blueprint per se. In and of itself, it doesn't code for any morphological structures, such as limbs, ears, eyes. To give an example, to exemplify this, say that researchers are studying a cat and they're interested in a particular genetic loci within the genome of that cat, and they notice that a mutant variant causes abnormal limb growth in the cat. Well, how that would be presented to the public is scientists discover the gene for limb development. But this is misleading. It's taken completely out of context because that gene functions within a network, an actual space-time network that is not only with other genes, but also within the cellular environment. And due to the homology of genes, that is the similarity of genes among species, if you were to, especially the similarity among mammalian species, if you were to splice that segment out of the feline genome and insert it into the homologous region or the same region within the human genome, you would most probably get a normal development of a human arm. See, that gene is not coding for paws within a cat. It could be malformed, but it's not a blueprint in that sense. This is the Hox gene cluster. When scientists first discovered this, they thought that they had finally found what could be the blueprint that gives rise to the body patterning. And they actually call this homeotic field selector genes. And that's a very subliminally based title for these genes because it's not in the context that they meant it, but it actually is very appropriate. So here, the reason they thought it was a blueprint is because the linear sequence of the genes on the genome collinearly related exactly to the segmentation, the development of the organism. In this case, Drosophila. But it was soon discovered that this is not a blueprint. As I've said, DNA is not a blueprint. Because if this was a blueprint that determined the body patterning and created this specific species of, say, this fly, then it should be different than the blueprint or the sequence in humans. But actually what you find is, across the entire animal kingdom, a high degree of conservation. It's nearly similar. In fact, you can swap out these segments and the individual, the organism, will develop normally. Again, it's not a blueprint, but that homeotic field selector genes, what it is doing is it's tuning into a field, a morphogenetic field, and that is informing the program of development. And I'll get to that a little bit more in detail. But one of the most touted achievements of molecular biology was when they rearranged these segments, they could get interesting phenomenology like the growth of legs where antennas should be. And that was found as one of the most exciting things in molecular biology, to grow legs out of a fly's head. Because you can see it's actually the front, on the front cover of this book. But I kind of laugh at it, but this book is one of the reasons as a teenager I actually got into the field of molecular biology. And I'm just bringing this up again. This is another sequence of genes within the genome that seems to be involved in body patterning. And I just bring it up because at New York University, there was a concerted effort to delineate the mechanisms by which these genes were involved in development. And so the genes are involved in body patterning, but scientists have not been able to explain how. Their theories are vastly complex, convoluted. You look at, they try to use what's called systems biology, and that gave birth to bioinformatics because they need terabytes, gigabytes of data storage in order to process these complex relationships that they're trying to use to describe development. And any time that you start to see this degree of complexity, I think it's a red flag that you might be going down the wrong road, because it's at the heart, nature, reality itself, is structured on very simplistic rules, laws, if you will. So no morphological structures are coded for within the genome. If you look at the genome, nowhere can you see a sequence for an arm, a leg, a human. What you do have, though, are a lot of, as they're called, open reading frames, or protein coding sequences, but they're coding for cellular processes, metabolism, mostly, maintenance of DNA, what we call housekeeping genes. They're just maintaining the biochemical environment of the cell. Kind of uninteresting. Another quick note, though, is that when you talk about DNA, it's always associated with proteins. This gets into the field of epigenetics. So within the cellular environment, DNA is a completely different animal than what you have isolated outside of the cellular environment. It's a completely different functionality. These proteins are actually affecting the functionality of the DNA to a large degree. So actually, in the 1940s, well, up until the 1940s, they didn't know if the heritable material was protein or DNA. It was assumed that it had to be protein, because protein was the only molecule that was complex enough to encode the information for making a new organism. And it was thought that the nucleic acids were just there to hold the protein together. And in fact, with the experiments in the 1940s that actually empirically showed that DNA was the heritable material, it was not accepted by the scientific community. The theory that DNA was the heritable material was not accepted for 20 years after empirical evidence has shown that it was. It wasn't until the 1950s when Watson and Crick delineated the double helix structure and the specific base pairing nature of the nucleotides that it became apparent that there was enough structural complexity to the DNA molecule to infer a code. So here is kind of a more accurate depiction of DNA. You have the nucleotide sequence in a polymer, and it's complex to proteins, histones. This is called chromatin. There's euchromatin, heterochromatin. And during certain cellular processes like aminogenesis, it's bundled up even tighter into chromosomes. And this is regulating the DNA, and it's found within the nucleus, and it's actually attached to the nuclear membrane, and that is regulating the DNA expression as well. So DNA is coding for, well, the genes that we hear about so often are coding for amino acids that are being synthesized into polypeptides, which make proteins, which are enzymes that drive the bodily cellular functions. Just a side note, so genes can also be spliced in a number of ways to give different isoforms, different gene products. I'll actually, when I return to the university, be given a presentation on an alternative splicing mechanism that determines the pluripotency, or the ability of embryonic stem cells to differentiate into any cell type within the body. It all depends on a splicing mechanism, on if a stem cell can be turned into a neuron or a liver cell, a skin cell, etc. So basically what I've talked about is the development is an orchestrated spatiotemporal program of genetic expression. These proteins are regulating the gene expression. Genes are producing proteins, in this case the structural protein, but this is an important protein in my talk. This protein polymerizes into what's called a microtubule. This polymer produces an axonal growth, and when it's done at the right place, at the right time during development, it'll produce brain structures. But having genes functioning at the right place at the right time is not sufficient to give rise to the complexity that is seen within organisms. There's too wide a range of possibilities for how that synthesis can occur. There must be another level of information that is collapsing the number of possibilities. Just like in quantum mechanics, the collapse of the wave function. The wave function represents a vast number of possibilities, but it collapses down into one definite probability. Now, that is the morphogenetic field, morphogenetic resonance. I'll be explaining this in detail, but in light of the theory of morphic resonance, what DNA is in terms of development, it functions as a morphogenetic germ. So when that specific genome is present, it will initiate the developmental cascade that gives rise to whatever species that genome is germane to, such as if it's a human genome, it acts as the initiator for development into a human. And it does that by morphic resonance, by tuning into the morphogenetic field, which I'll explain more about that in a moment. Within the adult organism, you've already developed. You have all your limbs and everything. So what is the DNA doing in that case scenario? It's actually acting as a central processor, integrating and computing signals from the cellular environment, also computing and integrating signals from consciousness, from thoughts, from the higher mind itself. And that is the bioenergetic interface with higher dimensional frequencies. Energy coming down through the chakras will come into the DNA, but if the DNA is described purely in physical terms, that doesn't make much sense. Hence the light-encoded DNA filament, the light body structure of the DNA. So the information field, information, it's driving the patterning of thoughts, behaviors, and the structure of the body. What is the information field? It's been described historically within Eastern philosophy as the Akashic field, within Western philosophy by Plato as the realm of perfect geometries. And Plato studied for 20 years within the secret mystery schools of Egypt. And what he was presenting to the world was advanced scientific knowledge that the Egyptians had. We're just now getting back to the depth of understanding that the ancients had of reality, the information field. So within the information field, there are morphogenetic fields, and it's just a matter of description. It's all one thing, but a certain subset of it is involved in morphogenesis and the patterning of organisms, which is very pertinent to speciation, because that's normally how you tell if a species is different from another species, is by the pattern and structure of its body. Well, within the morphogenetic field, these are living patterns, four-dimensional living geometries that inform and structure the biological organism, and much more than just physical development. Morphic fields, just another descriptive differentiation, structure and pattern thoughts and behaviors, hence you get instincts. It explains instinctual behavior, but these are living patterns. Now, Rupert Sheldrake is the man who actually synthesized this theory, and his theory is as revolutionary as Einstein's theory of relativity, as quantum mechanics theory was to physics. His theory is tantamount in biology. It's that revolutionary. So I was discussing before how complex it's gotten to try to describe simple processes. It's because the underlying assumptions are erroneous. His theory is simplistic and beautiful. And when it's understood, it's self-evident. When you understand his theory, you could see it at work in so many different cases. I would very strongly recommend reading any one of his books. He has 7 experiments that will change the world, how dogs know that their owners are coming home before their owners are home, etc. It's really brilliant, really amazing. So this morphic resonance, as I was saying, is collapsing in a sense, the wave function, the given probabilities. Now here is a polypeptide. So this is newly synthesized from the DNA. And there's a number of energy minima that it will go through to adopt a specific conformation, just like the information field. That conformation is going to give it its specific functionality. Its functionality is determined by its conformation, by its structure. The thing is that if that were to just happen spontaneously, each conformational change on the space-time program to get to the final conformation would take more time than the universe has been in existence to explore every given energy minima to get to the lowest. But an observation that happens within nanoseconds. So it's obviously being informed by an external morphogenetic field that is driving it into a very specific conformation. Now, I said that these theories describe a number of phenomenology that has evaded description. One of my favorites is how thoughts work. That's one of the hardest problems in science to be explained. But when you look at the brain activity when people are thinking, it is a spatio-temporal pattern of electromagnetic expression. Electric signals are being sent across neurons in a very specific pattern, in a space-time pattern. Now, that specific pattern within light of morphic resonance is tuning into the information field. The pattern of electrical excitation is tuning into the information field, and the information field is where you are deriving that thought. Now, the physical brain is not producing that activity. That activity is actually being produced by the higher mind, the non-physical element of the human mind. The higher mind is driving the electrical activity. The electrical activity acts as an interface between the information field and the physical brain, and so it comes into conscious perception. In this sense, the human brain has never had an idea. The human brain has never had a thought. Thoughts come from the higher mind. The higher mind conceives. The physical mind perceives. The physical mind is just perceiving what the higher mind is producing in morphic resonance. Now, as perception goes, it is producing electrical activity as you perceive elements in your environment and such. Just to show some of the mechanisms of this, you have here a pattern of neurons, and the specific pathways of electrical excitation are producing a space-time pattern that is tuning into very specific morphic fields, causing morphic resonance, and the information is perceived by the physical mind. Now, the brain can be rewired within seconds, because how long does it take to learn a new thing? You're learning right now all these new things almost nearly instantaneously. The brain is, it's called plastic because it's able to change its conformation very rapidly at the subsynaptic level. And these are called spines, actually. So this shows thousands of subsynaptic structures. And these can be seen to come and go within seconds, so that the brain is continually rewiring itself with every thought, with every experience. Your brain is literally rewiring itself. And this is just to give you kind of an idea of what level we're talking about. Here's the a brain here, and you can see all the all the neurons, a large bundle here in a complex pattern, and at a higher magnification, they're covered with these spines. So every thought and experience reconfigures the neuronal wiring, but it also changes the genetic expression. Some very interesting research has shown how with certain, with every experience, particular areas within the DNA are activated. It's called enhancer regions. Now, these regions function physically to enhance the expression of certain genes. But this was a very unique case in which the enhancer regions were creating the RNA intermediary between DNA and protein. And the RNA was actually going back, feeding back on the DNA and changing the expression of the genome. So every thought rewires the brain, changes the genomic expression of the brain. Here's the description. The enhancer RNA, eRNA, intensified the ability of neurons to produce protein. The widespread effect was something new. Here's showing an enhancer region that normally increases the rate of RNA synthesis and protein production. But in this case, the RNA was feeding back on the DNA with each experience. So I've been talking about the neurons, but one of the very interesting aspects of neurons, and actually every cell in the body, are these microtubule networks within the neuron itself. This is called the cytoskeleton. I actually prefer to call it the intracellular matrix. But the microtubules were actually posited by physicist Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff, MD, to be quantum mechanical structures involved in the creation of consciousness. The microtubules, as you saw earlier, are hollow tubes. And it was posited that within that hollow tube, it was sufficiently isolated from the environment to produce a quantum effect. Because within quantum mechanics, very strange phenomena are observed, such as entanglement, non-locality, coherent functions. But as soon as the particles, the subatomic particles, interact with the environment, that quantum state is lost. The wave function collapses. But Roger Penrose was positing that within the neuron, within these microtubules, the electrons could be sufficiently isolated from the cellular environment, the environment at large, to form quantum mechanical states, quantum coherent states. And he was using this to explain the genesis, the creation of consciousness itself. But he had to come up with this orchestrated collapse, this reduction to collapse the wave function. He used actually a microgravity. He kind of concocted an explanation for how the wave function could spontaneously collapse to produce consciousness. But this was largely unnecessary because it's actually consciousness itself that interrogates the quantum state and collapses it. But in the physical sciences, he was trying to explain consciousness as originating from a physical process. But this is largely erroneous. So, with specific space-time patterns within the brain producing thoughts, there are brain waves, characteristic brain waves produced from these spatiotemporal expression patterns. Alpha brain waves, beta brain waves that correspond to what kind of activity, what kind of patterns are being formed in your brain. There's a very particular one called a gamma oscillation. It's about 40 hertz. And it was first observed in meditating Tibetan monks. Now, I have just described the quantum mechanical nature of microtubules. And within entanglement, the quantum mechanical phenomenon, multiple particles actually behave as if they're one whole particle, one whole system. And so, with this gamma oscillation, what's seen is an electrical spatiotemporal pattern that's sweeping back and forth across the entire brain 40 times a second. And it's completely orchestrated. The entire brain is sending this orchestrated spatiotemporal pattern. What happens is this is actually causing the molecules within the microtubules, the electrons, to form a Bose-Einstein condensate, so that the entire brain is actually becoming one whole system. It's actually at the molecular level, not differentiated at all. There's no space-time separation, non-locality. And actually, every cell in the body has these microtubules. So, when you enter this meditative state of producing the gamma oscillations, that is actually cascading down through the entire body, forming a quantum coherent whole. And so what are you doing when you're meditating? You're cutting yourself off from the external environment. And as I said, it's the external environment that collapses the wave function, collapses the quantum coherent nature of the system. But see, the quantum coherent nature is actually the attractor of the biological organism. The biological organism is always moving towards quantum coherence, but with our interaction with the environment, we're blocking that. But it's within the quantum coherent system that magic occurs. Entanglement, non-locality, teleportation, etc. Now I can say from experience, I meditate every day, that when you enter this gamma oscillation, it actually is concurrent with the activation of the chakras. The third eye, Ajna chakra, opens up and you're enveloped in purple light. That's that higher dimensional frequency. And so you're forming a quantum coherent whole. Your entire body is a Bose-Einstein condensate. And you're tuning in to the frequency of the higher self, where all of your incarnations are occurring simultaneously. Multiple concurrent incarnations. The now moment, no past, no future. And from here, you can commune with your higher self and all your multiple incarnations. Now, This is a very interesting topic. You can Google this and find 10 fascinating cases of mind control. This is a different kind of mind control. This is mind control found within nature, but it exemplifies what I'm talking about with morphic resonance, how thoughts work. Because the well-known rabies virus, it infects the organism, and when it does so, it alters the behavior of the organism. So if it's altering the behavior, it must be coding for neurotransmitters. It must have genes that are creating new synaptic structures or neurons. But actually, when you look at the rabies virus, all it's coding for are structural proteins that that allow for the transmission and subsequent infection of the virus. There's no neurotransmitter genes or anything like that. What it does do, and so it's just creating new viral particles, but it also creates these black bodies as well, just protein aggregations. But so how could just a virus alter the behavior of an organism as if by mind control? It's actually the structure of the virus itself, its conformation, is tuning in to the morphic field. And in this case, it's hijacking the program of behavior that the animal is normally tuning into. And now all of a sudden, the animal has the voracious want to bite. And it just so happens that the bite is how the virus is transmitted. But there's, as I showed, 10 cases. One of my favorites is with fungus, cordyceps. That actually completely hijacks the behavior of its host. Now, these are supposed to be the most primitive and simple organisms, yet they can completely hijack the behavior of an organism and control it. Viruses are said to be, are thought to be even non-living. But this is, in my view, extremely advanced behavior. Now, this kind of, just on a side note, if these viruses are thought to be non-living, one of the questions within stem cell technology is when does life begin? Does it begin at insemination, shown here in vitro, or does it begin at birth? And this is the argument that is posited within this particular controversial topic. And I answer with another question: isn't it all living, from the cell up to the baby being born? It's all sacred life. To say that at any point it's not living is, I don't understand that completely. So we have a vast number of species on this planet, a very beautiful planet to be on. And it's true that, so we have, where do the species come from? We have the creation, and we have the evolution. But this is a this or that paradigm. It's either this or it's that. But there's also a this and that model that we can adopt, where seemingly contradictory and conflicting points of view actually have a middle ground. So is it intelligently designed? Yes. Does it undergo an evolutionary process? Yes, it's intelligently designed through an evolutionary process. Many of these organisms do have an extraterrestrial origin. Many organisms, species have been brought here from extraterrestrial locations. But many have also developed here on Earth naturally as well. So going back to morphogenetic fields, it is a very specific developmental pathway, a canonical pathway by which development occurs to create a specific species. Technically, this is called a creed. Now, this is actually the surface of a vinyl record. And it was very synchronistic that I found this to illustrate this point, because for me, music is life. Life is music. And I mean that on just about every level imaginable, and especially at a very scientific level. And this is Dr. Mei-Wan Ho, and she has developed a theory called quantum jazz. And I was talking about the quantum mechanical nature of the organism. But so she says, what one must imagine is an incredible hive of activity at every level of magnification in the organism, a light and sound extravaganza played out over most, if not all, of the 72 octaves of the electromagnetic spectrum. The cellular constituents that make us up are singing to each other. They're communicating to each other with light and sound. And this is actually a case in point of the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. Because if you were here for the Claire's presentation on biomimicry, she showed a deep sea video where all the deep sea animals had these incredible light displays. They're communicating with each other. And if you go outside, especially during sunset, you can hear the birds communicating to each other with sound. Well, the molecules of your body, the biomolecules, do the same thing. Just what's seen macroscopically is happening microscopically. They're communicating to each other with light and sound. And she calls it quantum jazz because within the quantum mechanical state, particles become entangled where they seem to be unified as a whole, but they're also able to be factored. They're factorizable, in which, although they're functioning as a whole, each particle still retains absolute freedom, in a sense. And though this seems paradoxical, it's a this and that situation again. Reflecting the macroscopic, that is actually how unity is obtained. How do you make a unified society? By allowing every individual to be their complete self, completely accepting every individual. That's how you create a unified whole, not trying to force anybody to behave in a certain way that is contradictory to their nature. That is how nature works at the subatomic level, by allowing everything to, every particle to function completely independently, and it forms a coherent whole. Her book, it's an ebook, The Rainbow and the Worm, The Physics of Organisms. So she's bringing in the synthesis of advanced physics to describe biology. If you do get this book, unless you're an avid physicist, you might want to skip through the beginning parts because it describes the thermodynamic nature of the living organism. But towards the end, it's extremely interesting, describing liquid crystals, biomolecular communication among the cellular constituents. It's a very, very, what she's doing is reviving science in a very large way. She has the Institute for Science and Society. And I made this very colorful because science doesn't have to be so serious, so austere. It can be playful, it can be fun. And she names it Isis. And that's no coincidence because it's the goddess energy. The goddess has been veiled for a while, but now she is unveiled. She is returned, and along with that is information and wisdom. And you can see her journal here. It's actually very colorfully illustrated, but make no mistake, the scientific theories propounded in her journal are very profound. So the sound, the transduction of sound and the communication of the body at a quantum level within quantum mechanics, this was described. So here you have soliton-like excitations in biological systems. And it's talking about the transfer of phonons, sound particles, among biomolecules. The use of sound and modulating the activity of the biological organism. This was first described by Herbert Froelich. And here he has a demonstration of phonons being created. But in his theory, he described how metabolism within the organism can pump up the energy state enough that it forms a quantum state where, again, it forms a Bose-Einstein condensate where instantaneous communication occurs between every part of the body. And Mei-Wan Ho has taken this knowledge along with the arrangement of biomolecules within what's called the extracellular matrix to show how it creates a body consciousness. The body itself is conscious through this instantaneous communication. This actually shows a sound, a phonon, a sound particle traveling along a polymer. So when it comes to things like sound and light therapy, how does that work? Well, it works scientifically. It works at a scientific level. That's the Egyptians, well, many of the ancients used sound for healing, etc. It was an advanced science, frequency modulation. Sound is directly affecting the activity of the biological molecules. So if one is acting aberrantly, its frequency, its sound frequency, is out of alignment. When a correct sound frequency is introduced, it now begins to function holistically again, normally again, and health is restored. So going back to the morphic resonance, morphogenetic field, what creates speciation is this very specific canonical pathway that's instructed by the morphogenetic field. And it's by the conformations of specific biomolecules. But what can happen is the alternative isoforms can drive a specific developmental pathway into another creole, another morphogenetic pattern. So this can actually be used to create a new species. So here you see it starts off looking pretty much all the same, but each one has a slightly different genome. It's acting as a morphogenetic germ, causing differentiation into a different end product. Now, if you look at that genome, that morphogenetic germ, only 1.5% in the human genome is actually coding for gene products. So it's not the genes that are driving this differentiation process, because this is only accounting for 1% of the functionality of the genome. 99% of the function of the genome is unexplained up until this point. So it's non-coding DNA. It doesn't produce a gene product. Now, one of the most misleading events ever was to call this junk DNA. It's understandable because if all the heredity and all the functionality of an organism was from the genes, which I think I've already demonstrated is erroneous, then anything that's non-coding must be useless. But I think we all know even intuitively that nature doesn't make useless things. So the origin of the term junk DNA is actually from Susumu Ono in 1972. This is actually a very brilliant researcher. You just have to understand the context, the historical context in which this term originated. But And so the title of this paper is So Much Junk DNA in Our Genome, and this term actually stuck. But his paper is actually wonderfully elucidative. So he says you take the amount of DNA that a human has, and you take the simplistic assumption that the amount of DNA should mirror the number of genes. That means there should be about 3 million or so genes contained in our genome. The falseness of such an assumption becomes clear when we realize that the genome of the lonely lungfish and salamanders can be 36 times greater than our own, because these two species have about 36 times more genetic material than a human. He actually presciently went on to show how, because of the mutation rate, there was actually an upper limit to the number of genes that could even actually be contained within a genome. But he says only a fraction of our DNA appears to function as genes. But because of the upper limit due to the mutation rate, he was able to, in 1972, accurately predict the number of genes within the genome. He says only 6% of our DNA-based sequences is utilized as genes. And it's about 1 to 5%. And so this is 1972, and we didn't conclusively discover the number. Well, it's not exactly conclusive, but we didn't discover a more accurate number until we completely sequenced the genome. So only 1 to 5% of protein coding sequences. The rest are non-coding sequences, such as mobile genetic elements or transposons. And this is actually a stain. These chromosomes, these human chromosomes, have been stained for a very particular mobile genetic element that is specific to primates and is actually very specific to humans. It's found in a copy number of 1 million copies within the human genome. So there's about 5,000 genes, there's about 1 million copies of this specific genetic mobile element. It's a retrotransposon. So everything that's stained green here is this specific, it's a retrotransposon, a mobile genetic element. So if you look here, chromosome 19 is shown as a homologous pair here with the parental and maternal chromosomes. It's almost completely green. It's almost completely this mobile genetic element, this retrotransposon, except for the centromere, which is it's an architectural component of the chromosome involved in the proper segregation. So you can see that this must be hugely important. And this was a conclusion I had come to, is that the differentiation of species must be from this non-coding DNA. So that mobile genetic element is called the ALU element. Now, when I first saw this, when I first began to investigate it, it appeared to be clearly engineered. I began to think that this was an element of the genome that must have been engineered possibly by the Anunnaki in the creation of the human species. Now, as I began to investigate it, I actually found that this would be largely unnecessary to engineer this specific element to create the human species, because it's actually found in a number of primates. And as I investigated further, retrotransposition occurs within all complex organisms. Now, I haven't ruled out that this element within the genome wasn't engineered to create hominid species. It's still very possible, but I think that it might have been unnecessary. So I'm not sure if I made clear what retrotransposition is. It was called a mobile genetic element because what these segments of the genome do is they copy themselves and reinsert themselves in different locations within the genome. So what can occur is a complete reconfiguration of the genome through these mobile genetic elements. And as we've seen through morphic resonance, confirmation is what resonates with the information field. So if you rearrange the structure of the genome, you tune into a different information, a different morphogenetic field, you have a different morphogenetic pattern. But so as I investigated it, I found that it probably wasn't specifically engineered to create the human species. It actually has an element within the genome that is pre-existing called the 7SL signal sequence. It's involved in the appropriate segregation of newly synthesized proteins so that they find the correct location within the cell. So if you look at the, if you compare the human and chimpanzee chromosomes, you find that there's only a 1.2% difference between the gene coding regions of these two species. So it's not the genes that are causing difference between these two organisms. It must be the non-coding sequences of the DNA. So these non-coding sequences are causing different structural variations within the chromosomes. So when you have different structural components of the chromosomes, it's tuning into different morphogenetic fields, as I said, and you get different species. Also, different chromosome numbers. This is found to produce rapid speciation. Just by even doubling the number of chromosomes, you can produce a new species instantaneously, nearly. And architectural differences within the genome. So comparing human and chimpanzee genomes, these telomeres and centromeres, this was actually elucidated by Lloyd Pye to a large extent in his presentation. This is chromosome 2, but you can see that these architectural differences cause different conformations of the genome. So, in engineering the human species, if you rearrange the chromosomes, if you create a different number of chromosomes, you will create a new species. So, if there is a pre-existing hominid species that has perhaps naturally evolved on the Earth, so it's in tune with the Earth, it's specifically adapted for the Earth, this would be a prime candidate if you wanted a slave species on the planet, because it'd be uniquely adapted to that environment. So if you took it and you rearranged the DNA, if you gave it a different chromosome number, you could create a new species. So if the Anunnaki rearranged the DNA such that it was similar to their own DNA conformation, it would give that pre-existing hominid species many of the characteristics of this extraterrestrial species, such as cognitive capabilities. And this is what is seen, how DNA repairs can reshape the genome, because these mobile genetic elements are oftentimes mobilized during when there are breaks within the DNA. The mobile genetic elements were first discovered and delineated by Barbara McClintock, and she won a Nobel Prize for this. But when she discovered it, she theorized that the mobile genetic elements must be involved in the rapid reconfiguration of the genome to adapt to the environment. This was in the 1950s, around that she was, the 1960s, that she was elucidating this mechanism, and she was largely ignored by the scientific community for a long time. But she eventually got the Nobel Prize for showing that mobile genetic elements are clearly involved in restructuring the genome. So how these mobile genetic elements work is an experiment where gamma radiation increases endonuclease-dependent L1 retrotransposition. That's a retrotransposon being activated by the specific frequency. Because gamma radiation is just an electromagnetic frequency, a light. And beyond that, beyond gamma rays, are cosmic rays, which are constantly coming in from the universe. These cosmic rays are activating the mobile genetic elements within the DNA, causing the DNA to reconfigure itself. And what's actually occurring is an increase in the cosmic radiation coming in at this time. If you look historically, you can see major extinction events followed by rapid speciation. So this actually occurs in a 35 million year period. So you can see it corresponds directly to the oscillation of the solar system through the galactic disk. As the solar system comes into the galactic disk, cosmic radiation increases, which is going to activate these mobile genetic elements and start to reconfigure the DNA. Now, initially, the DNA of, say, that pre-existing hominid species was arranged in a very coherent manner, such that the consciousness was able to move through all of the dimensions. It was aligned in that sense. Now, the Anunnaki probably didn't want a species that was spiritually enlightened or capable of such spiritual enlightenment. So, one of the primary things that was probably done is to actually, using frequency, rearrange that coherent sequence of DNA into a non-coherent form, so that it's all jumbled up, so they can no longer align and bring that consciousness into awareness of multiple dimensions. That actually kind of creates a cage, a dimensional cage, a frequency cage. So it's all done with frequency. So how do you get a decoherent DNA strand? You use a decoherent frequency such as fear. So it's almost like massive trauma being reflected at the molecular level, because it's causing fragmentation. So you see that we have been very fragmented, very compartmentalized, and this is reflected within the genome. Now, with this new frequency coming through, the genome can be rearranged again. If there's the frequency of love, it's going to be recombined in a coherent manner. It's going to go into a sequence that actually aligns with higher levels of consciousness, that actually allows you to access multiple dimensions. And actually, at Adam's calendar, Michael Tellinger has shown that there are specific frequency signatures there. So I was saying that I was thinking they were using splicing. They were using the ALU element to reconfigure the genome, but I came to the conclusion that this would be unnecessary because they could do it completely using frequency. Just using frequency, they can completely restructure the genome. So the other 45% of the genome are highly repetitive sequences, microsatellites, as they're called, variable nucleotide tandem repeats. And it's just a small sequence, say ATTG, repeated multiple times, anywhere from 80 to 800 times, so that there's thousands of base pairs within one of these so-called satellite regions. Now, from a scientific perspective, with the assumption of only physical nature to the DNA, this was seen as complete junk. It must be useless, because if all of the structural complexity of the DNA came from the variation in the nucleotide sequence, a repeating sequence would have no function. But what's found is that these sequences can actually expand and so incorporate more DNA. And also, the specific sequence repeats can cause different conformational structures of the DNA. And I've already talked a lot about how important conformation is with tuning into the information field. So DNA can adopt a range of conformations, and each one is going to change the functionality of the DNA, not only at the physical level with the proteins that are produced, but also at the non-physical level with how it interacts with the information field. So, with these repeat sequences, 50% of the genome, it can even adopt triple helical DNA, 3 strands of DNA, even more. This is showing the canonical B form and how it can change into different conformations. But it can even adopt a 4-stranded architecture, 4 strands of DNA. Now, this 4-stranded DNA is going to have significantly different functionality as far as how it's interfacing with the information field, and thus the behavior, consciousness, and nature of the organism in which it's occurring. This is showing how it can function on a physical level to block gene expression. And this has actually been recognized as a way in which speciation can occur. The tandem repeats, how they can shape the genomic architecture. So here, this is outside of the cellular environment. These are specific conformations that have been identified, such as this cruciform structure, triple helix, multiple slip strand structures, folded structure. This is just what's seen outside of the cell. But as I've said, within the cellular environment, the DNA behaves very differently. The kind of conformations, multiple stranded conformations that could be occurring are probably, at this point, unknown, but could be very vast. Now, these repeat sequences are actually what are used in such things as DNA fingerprinting. Now, right there is the answer. If these tandem repeat sequences are what is able to distinguish one individual from another, they must be what is actually causing the difference between individuals, the differences between species. Hardly junk DNA at all. Here you can see how the very specific nature of how each individual has a completely different expression of these repeat sequences, can be used to identify them. Now, if you look at the genes among these individuals, there's maybe only a 2% difference. You can't distinguish them at all. So it's not the genes. I don't have enough time to go into some of these, but these are extracellular matrix proteins, and their conformations as well have a large impact. You can see here how it forms almost a circuit board on the cell surface, antennas receptive to frequency. These run throughout the entire body, Langer lines. So it's a vast communication system, far more interconnected than the nervous system. It contacts all 3 million cells of the body. And actually this Langer system, Dr. Mei-Wan Ho has shown how it corresponds to the acupuncture meridian lines. It could be the physical correlate. It interfaces, it complexes with water. And acupuncture is the movement of qi. Well, Wilhelm Reich showed how orgone energy is intimately related to water. So these are also liquid crystalline water networks complex to the collagen. The intracellular matrix connects to the DNA as well, and it forms this huge communication network of every cell in the body, and it's actually a fiber optic network. If you were to peel these away, these tubules, you'd see light strands. It's those micro tubules that I was talking about. The electrons inside have light moving through it, and this light is communicating with the DNA and transmitting among every cell in the body. This is just showing how the DNA can be used to compute these signals, integrate them, and cause changes within the behavior of the cellular constituents. So I've got to kind of move along. I'm running out of time. I apologize. This works by using light, which was something very interesting. But so DNA is not just a morphic field selector for constructing the body. It's also a storage medium for optical information, as well as an organ for communication. This gets into its the light-encoded nature, the third strand of DNA, the light-encoded strand of DNA. So Dr. Pop actually showed biophoton emission by DNA. And this had actually been shown to a large degree by Russian scientists.